all our board work on Tuesdays mostly. It's a shame. It's such a big board.
Exactly.
Yeah, really.
We're going to talk about the Torah portion. We'll go back to the stops along the way on Tuesdays and finish those up. But the Torah portion is Kitet Zeh, which is pretty important. It means when you go or if you go. It covers, as far as just opening the book and reading through it, it covers civil laws and domestic laws and inheritance and wayward children, lost and found, rooftop safety. And you got to build a fence around your terrace so that your guests don't fall off. And it talks about kidnappings. It talks about prohibited mixtures. In tonight's case, we're going to examine 5 verses out of Devarim 21, 10 through 14. It says, is it real if it sounds good? And the verses we're talking about tonight are going out to battle and you bring back captives, and if you happen to see a beautiful woman that you can take her and all this stuff. And well, we don't go to battle and we don't have to worry about that stuff. But we listen to what Paul has to say at Ephesians 6:12. It says, for our conflict is not with flesh and blood, but with principalities, with those in authority, and with the possessors of this dark world, and with the evil spirits that are beneath heaven. Evil spirits that are beneath heaven. Yeshua said that the Father is seeking worshipers who will worship Him in spirit and in truth. We have to have truth in order for us to be able to connect spiritually with our Elohim. And if we get something spiritually that is off kilter, it's going to throw us off. And it's going to really cause, as we'll read in our study, it's going to cause some issues. But we have to have truth in order for us to be spiritually linked to our Elohim. So, we're going to consider this week's Parsha. The Torah portion involves the taking home and marrying of a beautiful captive woman. And we're going to focus on verses 12 through 14. Now, we all read articles, watch TVs, take in a varied source of information. Knowing what is in line with the Word of Elohim and being able to separate it from what is not can be tricky, especially when what doesn't line up sounds really good and right. And Yeshua said that broad is the way that leads to salvation. He said, but narrow, or broad is the way that leads to destruction, but narrow is the path that leads to salvation, to redemption. And there's very few people that are on that path. Now, all this stuff can sound good, these doctrines that are thrown at us and all these wonderful things. But in these verses, we're going to see what happens when we allow these types of deceptive ideas or spiritual influences into our house, which is into our lives. I've said that it's what happens in the spiritual, it's what happens in the supernatural that affects what happens in the physical. And we have to have an understanding that our Elohim is in command, and His way is what is going to be done. His will is what's going to be done. And we can rebel against that, or we can understand it and do our best to stay within the narrow boundaries of that road that leads to salvation. So, we begin the Torah portion is Kitet Zeh. It says, when you go forth, or if you go forth, to battle against your enemies, and Yehovah your Elohim delivers them into your hands, and you carry them away captive, and you see among the captives a beautiful woman, and you have a desire for her, and would take her to you as a wife. And would take her to you as a wife. Now, according to Rashi, this desire to take her to you as a wife comes from the Yetzer Hara. It comes from the evil inclination within. Because as we'll see, there was a very strict commandment about taking captives, getting intermingled or anything else with the pagan peoples that were in Canaan. So it's the Yetzer Hara that drives the desire, not the will or the desire to do the will of Elohim. It says, then you shall bring her home to your house, and she shall shave her head and pare her nails. Verse 13 says, and she shall put the raiment of her captivity from off her, and she shall remain in your house, and bewail her father and her mother a full month. And after that you may go in unto her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. And it shall be, verse 14, and it shall be, if you have no delight in her, then you shall let her go where she will. But you shall not sell her at all for money. You shall not deal with her as a slave, because you have humbled her. Okay? We can imagine reading ordinances on and on and on like this, that really, we would say, this doesn't apply to us today. You know, it's part of that Old Testament stuff. We don't need it. But everything in Torah is just as relevant today as it was back then. We just have to look at it from a different point of view.
This one doesn't fall under a civil law.
Okay, it could fall under
It
a
could,
civil law.
but
Yeah, civil or
it is not.
domestic.
We don't have a
domestic law.
Sanhedrin, and we're not.
Well, I mean, we're not going out to battle, and we're not
Right.
we're not picking females out of the captives to bring home as our concubines, as our wives. So, how can we apply this today? And that's something we're going to look at. The rabbis have said that we've barely tapped our understanding of the Torah. There was one rabbi that I read a lecture or watched a lecture on YouTube by, and I can't remember his name, he was French. But he said, we've only tapped 1% of what the Torah has to tell us. And if that's the case, then it's a vastly uncharted, unexplored area. So anyway, but listen to what we have. If we can look at it from our understanding of Adam and Ish and Isha, that Ish is the physical aspect of worship, and Isha is the spirit that comes forth from that physical aspect of worship, then let's look at it from this point of view, that Yahuwah commanded that all the pagan peoples in Canaan be destroyed, and that's at Devarim 20:16. The type of battle spoken of here, according to Rashi, is an optional battle fought voluntarily on a non-obligatory basis, as it involves the taking of captives. They wouldn't take captives if Elohim directed them to go to war, because Elohim said what? Don't leave anything alive. Okay? So, in other words, fighting a battle not specified by Elohim. And it's interesting that the captives taken are going to include Canaanites, and we read in Scripture that the children of Israel were disobedient in not destroying the Canaanites to the point, or destroying the Canaanites like they were supposed to, that they even made covenants with them. And we read that this all starts in the book of Joshua, and we also read how it continues on, the problems that develop in the book of Judges, and how it begins the trickle effect of allowing this into their worship really explodes. But the result of this was the pagan influence that would eventually, several hundred years later, lead the children of Israel back into captivity. So these next few verses will show us how allowing that which is contrary to the word of Yahuwah Elohim into our house as a wife, and what it can do to us as individuals. So we're going to consider a few innocent words in verse 11. Verse 11 says, and you see among the captives a beautiful woman, and you have a desire for her, and would take her to you as a wife. So the first word we examine is beautiful, which is actually stated a woman of goodly form. And it's the word toar, which is used for goodly form. The word means shape, form, figure, and appearance. The origin of this word is ta'ar, which means to be drawn away from, to delineate, and to be dubious, to cause doubt. This word is coupled with beautiful, yafeh, which means beautiful, from a root that means to be bright. So we can consider an idea that just because something is beautiful and appears to give off light, underneath it can be dubious and can draw us away from the truth. Okay?
That's good.
Everybody catch that? Because that's important. I'll read it again. It says that just because something is beautiful and appears to give off light, underneath it can be dubious and can draw us away from the truth. The verse says that we see such and have a desire for it, even to the point of marriage. The word for wife is Isha. And we've discussed it in the past that it represents the spiritual side of Adam. So this is something that's going to affect us spiritually. So now we see that if this desire left unchecked can bring a spiritual issue into our house. So we'll go on to verse 12. Our house is our life. Verse 12 says, "Then you shall bring her home to your house, and she shall shave her head and pare her nails." Well, doesn't that sound pleasant? She's going to be a real looker when she's done. And according to Rashi, that was exactly the reason. She's going to come home and she's going to try to make herself as ugly as possible so that she will be despised and let go. It's a tactic. Okay?
And apparently, typical translation has that painting her nails, but appears to be cutting her nails.
Cutting her nails. Actually, Rashi says it's to allow her nails to grow long so that they're ugly. So, but let's look at it from this point of view. So we have decided that what the rabbi, the preacher, the news reporter, televangelist, and whatever article and whatever we've read is so good that we have to incorporate it into our belief system. What happens when the dubious begins to trickle from the beautiful? She shall shave her head. First consider she, and this is Isha that we mentioned earlier, so we will consider that we have brought a spiritual influence that we know nothing about into our life. The above scripture warns us about what may be concealed under beauty. So what happens? Shall shave. Vegilech ah, meaning, among other things, to lay waste. To lay waste. And her head, well, first of all we see et. We see the aleph and the tav, a representation of the word and salvation and the restoration of Yehovah, right before the word rosha, which means head from the root resh, meaning authority. So what is the first thing that begins to happen when we allow an unchecked doctrinal idea into our belief system? We can gather from this so far that our truth is affected, which begins or can begin to affect our relationship with our Elohim. But if we read the whole thing, Vehilach et Rosha, she shall shave her head, and considering the meanings, we can get an idea of what can happen. The authority of the word and salvation, restoration of Yehovah Eloheinu is laid waste. So what about per? Per is vesaat ah. Her nails et siforene ya. Per comes from a word asa, meaning to fashion, but it also means to act with an effect, to have an effect on something. And nails are siporen, meaning not only fingernails, but the root of this word is safar, which means to skip about, to cause doubt, to be dubious. So in ve'asat a et sifore ya, and pare her nails, we get an idea of acting with effect to cause doubt. So what happens when we bring an untested and unproven idea into our belief system and relationship? We bring it into our belief system and into our relationship with our Elohim. From what we've just kind of taken apart, we can get an idea of this and consider this. The authority of the word and salvation, restoration of Yehovah Eloheinu, that is our Elohim, is laid waste, while the dubious spirit, the beautiful woman of godly form or goodly form, causes us to delineate, go off course, acting with effect to cause doubt. This isn't a good situation, but we look at the next word, or the next verse, and we're going to see that that's not all that can happen. There's more to it than just that. So verse 13, and she shall put the raiment of her captivity from off her, and shall remain in your house, and bewail her father and her mother a full month, and after that you may go in unto her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. So we've allowed this spiritual manifestation into our life. We have seen what begins to take place, but now we're going to see that something happens when it starts to take root. Beginning with she shall put, vehe sirah, from the root sur, meaning not only to put, but also to turn aside, to depart from, to avoid, and to come to an end. The next word to consider is raiment, which is simlat, from simla, that means clothing rooted in semel, which means images, idols, statues. Are these put off? Before the word simlat, we see again the subject pointer et, a representation of the Aleph and the Tav, the word of Yehovah, so that what is put off is the word of Yehovah. And what shall remain in your house is the spirit of idolatry and the doubt and ill effect that it causes. Okay?
Wow.
The word remain is yashab. And it means not only to remain, but it means to dwell. This false spiritual manifestation will now dwell in your life, and bewail her father and her mother. Uvaketa et aviyah va'et ima. The word for bewail is baka. And it also means to bemoan, to complain, and to make lamentation. In the Hebrew letters, we see that what is affected by this, and what is truly lamenting here, we see it in et abiyah, her father. In this, we see, again, et, the Aleph and the Tav, the word of Yehovah. In the Ab, we see the Aleph, which is a representation of Yehovah Elohim. We see the Beit, which is a representation of the house. So the house of Yehovah Elohim. But we also notice in the word Abiyah that we have the Yod, the truth, power, and the ability of the very Spirit, because there's the He of Yehovah, that's the very Spirit that brings forth creation, that brings forth renewal. We see that the He in the word Bachabaram, where it means we're created, that His very breath brought forth creation. So a lot of things are being affected spiritually in our relationship with our Father, Yehovah, our Eloheinu. Now, what's also affected is Ve'et Ima, her mother. And in this we see the letters themselves, that the very word and the salvation and restoration of Yehovah is being affected as well. If we take a look at Ve'et Ima, in Ima we see the Aleph that represents our Elohim. We see the Mem that represents His word. We see the He, which is telling us first to pay attention, but it also represents the Spirit. But what it also affects is our redemption, because in Va'et we see what? We see a Vav that represents the flesh, but we see the Aleph and the Tav And if the Aleph and the Tav became flesh,